Night. All right, Jane, all you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks everyone for joining us. I want to just also reiterate some of the housekeeping items. If you can keep yourself on mute, that would be very helpful for our audio quality. And also, if you have questions as we go through, please do use the chat feature. We can keep track of questions and feed them into whoever may be able to answer them. So I am going to just give a quick overview of some of the county COVID news from today, and then I'll introduce our special guest so we can hear from her. So I want to just mention a few things briefly. One is that we now have we have relationships with some hotels to provide respite care for people who are coming out of the hospital who need a place to recuperate. They don't have one that they can go to safely. And then also for people who need to be in isolation. So we're really setting up some of those options. We're also working with the hospitals in the county to set up an alternative care, medical care site. So in case when we get a surge, if we need an additional setup to help take care of patients, we will have that available. There are also some FEMA trailers coming. I can't remember how many, but those will be some housing options for people as well. And then I want to just speak to, so we've been getting a lot of communication from people about a press release that went out late last week about county parks. And it seemed to have created a wrong impression out there. The county health officer has been very clear that all residents are to shelter in place at their home, with some exceptions for certain basic essential activities, which do include outdoor recreational activity. And the press release was designed to clarify the social distancing requirements, and also to suggest hiking and bicycling and so on, while maintaining that social distance. Any gathering of people outside of your household is not allowed at all. So the press release was talking about that these rules will be in place over the holiday weekend on Easter, and people seem to misunderstand that we were inviting people to come gather at the county parks. So that is not the case. And so we encourage you to get outside. The weather is going to be beautiful, and keep social distance in wherever you are, in your neighborhood or out on the trails on Fort Ord or in a county park. So that's my update. And I will watch for any chat questions. I can't do it right now for some reason. It's not coming up. Oh, there we go. There's a question about the peak date. I don't know what is being predicted for that. I am hearing that in 2 to 3 weeks, we are likely to see an increase in the numbers of cases transmitted, but I don't know whether that's going to be the end of it or not. So that's the only time frame that I've really heard at this point.
And there's also a question about the EOC level 1. Do we have an explanation for people about what that means? It's kind of a technical internal function that the Emergency Operations Center was moved from level 2 to level 1. it enables increased internal communication, activates certain staff. I think it's really more of a technicality. I don't think it has no bearing on the rules regarding sheltering in place or other, I think, more important information that we have to put out there. So it's really a technicality internally.
Yes, thank you. And I think one thing is that it means that that I think there are people available 24/7. I'm not sure if that was available before, but yeah, thank you for that question as well. And thanks, Kristi, for making sure I didn't miss it. So
there is one more question. I guess in Santa Clara County, they've put out a public notice that they're willing to pay for old ventilators that may be broken or out of commission. Their public health department in Santa Clara County is asking people to find those old ventilators that might be in storage so that they can get those their ventilator capacity increed. So we don't have any requests like that coming out of Monterey at this point. But
right. So in Monterey County, though, if you do have a functioning ventilator, what do they call it, the N95, sometimes people have some that they haven't used, or if you have any personal protective equipment that you're not using that you would like to donate, you can contact Mike Durr in our purchasing department, and I'm sure that my fabulous staff will find a way to put up his email so that that's available to you. We do get a lot of questions from people in the community who want to be helpful by donating these things, and Mike Durr is taking the lead on that. A question about whether there'll be another press release clarifying the clarification. So we have been asking for talking points for the shelter in place. We are promised them. I'm not sure we've received them, but as soon as we have them available, if you're on my email distribution list, we will be sending that out to people. And I do expect there will be a press release tomorrow, a revised one about the county parks situation. So I do want to move to introducing our special guest. I want to thank Susan Swick for being with us. She is a relatively new addition to our county. We're very fortunate to have someone with her skills and her specialty in child and adolescent mental health. She's come to us to really build out the Ohana resource that was made available to us by a generous contribution from Bertie Bialek Elliott, and we have asked her to come lend her expertise to us for children and adolescents and all people in talking about our mental health. And I loved, I saw somewhere that she had said that mental health doesn't necessarily equate directly with happiness, but rather with resilience. And I think that's something that we can all use some more tips on how to make sure that we're accessing all that we need to stay resilient in these very different times that we're in. So Dr. Swick, please take over and give us what you got.
Okay, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes, thank you.
That's better than resilience for me if I actually can figure out how to press the right button. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join this group. I'm delighted to have a chance to connect with everyone virtually. I look forward to having chances to connect in person, which is always the best way to connect, although we're discovering the joys of virtual connection these days. And I'm actually delighted to have a chance to talk about sort of how do we tend to our mental health in these circumstances, as well as the health of our children and our teenagers and the rest of our family and people that are not maybe right in our homes. How will our children do at a time of uncertainty and turbulence is directly connected to how well we do. So I think without it being frivolous, it's actually critical that we think about how are we tending to our mental health and our well-being, and that will have the greatest impact on how our kids do. It is true that I've thought a lot about what is mental health before, or not just at times of public distress or crisis. Psychiatry hasn't been great at defining mental health. Freud long ago said that it was an ability to love and work, and then we kind of left it there. But child psychiatrists have thought for quite a while about resilience. And resilience being a critical ingredient, and possibly the critical ingredient in mental health. Mental health is not the absence of mental illness any more than cardiac health is not having had a heart attack. Oh, look at that. Thank God I didn't have to do that too. That's fantastic.
All right, so just let me know and I'll advance to the next slide for you, okay?
Thank you. I guess we can advance to the next one. I think the next one just talks about resilience. There we go. So yeah, mental health is not the absence of mental illness any more than cardiac health is the absence of a heart attack. If you haven't had a heart attack, that's great, but you really don't know how healthy your heart is until you put it under some stress and see how well it handles the stress of an intense workout, of climbing up a mountain, or of an actual cardiac stress test. And then how well it regains its equilibrium after the stress of a big challenge. And the same is true of mental health. And the good news is that happiness is easier to come by when you're mentally healthy, but it's not the same as mental health. And I think often when we're in difficult circumstances, we worry that our mental health is suffering because we are stressed. But the truth is that stress, every stressful event is an opportunity to cultivate resilience. And that's what we're going to talk about, hopefully for 20 or so minutes. So there's plenty of time for questions. And feel free to unmute yourself and chime in if I'm prattling on too long and I'm impeding your resilience instead of helping it. I'm happy to answer questions during. So we're going to think a little bit more about what are the critical ingredients in resilience. And this is the simple definition, the simplest definition, that resilience is a capacity to adapt in a setting of adversity. And I'll invite you to think about what is adversity. Of course, right now, we're thinking about the adversity that first responders may be experiencing, people in hospitals are experiencing, the adversity that we're experiencing if we're at home, having to homeschool our kids while still working, or the adversity that people are experiencing who've lost their job, or who've had to shutter their business or furlough their employees. There's also lots of very small experiences of adversity. Boredom is actually a kind of adversity. It's probably the gentlest kind of adversity, but it's a challenge, it's uncomfortable, and it's something that people have to figure out a way to bear, to hold. If you try to avoid even the smallest adversity like boredom, your capacity to manage the next adverse experience, a bigger experience, is not going to be as strong. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study, and Wendy, we can bump to the next slide. This is just an image to help transport you a little bit to what I think is probably the first study of resilience. Without doubt, it's the longest study of resilience. Back in 1939 at Harvard University, a group of psychiatrists and psychologists decided that they wanted to study success. That was their mission. And they thought, where better to study success than in their own backyard? So they decided to do a rich and nuanced study of Harvard undergraduates. This was back in the day when you could get funding to do a long-term observational study in the social sciences. And they set about studying the entire sophomore class over 2 different years. So it was about 400 young white men. And what they did was an exhaustive interview with each of these men, and then a battery of psychological and physical tests. And then they repeated this every other year until the present. They continue this study now. And they also decided they needed a control group to compare to this student group. And so they went next door. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with Massachusetts. It's where I spent the last 20 years. And it's very Harvard, but they decided to go next door to Cambridge, to Dorchester, a very impoverished blue-collar community now full of immigrants. And they recruited 400 young men who were matched for age, physical, and psychological characteristics. They called these young men disadvantaged but not yet delinquent, or as they would have said, like disadvantaged but not delinquent from Dorchester. And they enrolled them in the study as their control group. Now, what the researchers were hoping to learn about was not just who succeeded and who failed. They expected, actually, that all of the Harvard students would succeed and the young men from Dorchester would fail. They actually wanted to learn what set apart normal success from the super succeeders, right? The CEOs, the Nobel laureates, the presidents of the United States, from the good doctors, lawyers, and bankers that were coming out of Harvard. And indeed, in this original cohort of students was John F. Kennedy. He was part of the first cohort of this study. And after about 15 years, they were quite surprised to find that a lot of the young men from Harvard, who they thought were destined for spectacular success, came up against an obstacle or a setback, and they faltered. And they never regained their footing. They lost a job, and they became dependent on alcohol. Their marriage fell apart, and they never found their way back onto a track of happiness or well-being. They were also surprised to discover that some of the young men from Dorchester overcame spectacular obstacles to build lives of great meaning and great success, both in work and in their relationships. So it was in the probably the early 60s when they decided this was really not a study of super succeeders. This was a study of resilience, of what it was that enabled certain young men, in this case, to manage adversity, to regain their footing, and to continue building a life that was successful in relationships and in work. And they found that a few things were fixed. Actually, in the years since, they've enrolled women in the study too. They found actually that being female confers some resilience advantage. So, well, you know, women, we take what we can get. That one is a good one. And they found that certain habits of self-care, getting enough sleep, exercise, not drinking too much, these all seem sort of obvious. Maybe some of these things are easier if you're already healthy. But what they found that was far and away the most powerful predictor of resilience was a quality they called an internal locus of control. And this is a terrible, shrinky term. I apologize for the field that we come up with terms that don't ring like poetry. But an internal locus of control is essentially a belief that the circumstances of your life are a function of your choices, right? So it's not a delusional belief that you control the weather, that you have magical powers. It's a belief that the choices we make have consequences. And if you don't like the circumstances you are in, you look around and think about what other choices could I make to change my circumstances. So we'll go on and I'll tell you about a summary of all of the ingredients in resilience. And that's right, next slide. And if I was to try to offer you a summary from the psychiatric or psychological literature, everything would include a minimum of 16 ingredients in resilience. We tend to be, as a field, very exhaustive and very detailed. And I found a beautiful article by a business journalist named Diane Kotu. I'll happily share it with you afterwards, Wendy, and you can disseminate it if anybody's interested. Where she decided to review all the literature and summarize resilience for a business audience. And she categorized it as being 3 main ingredients. And I think her summary is really comprehensive and memorable. I reframed some of the words for her so I could remember it. But the first ingredient is to be perceptive. And this is very simply cultivating a capacity to face and bear reality. It sounds very simple, but it's not so easy when reality is unwelcome, right? So it's an ability to discern what's going on with clear eyes, not with rose-colored glasses, not with gray-colored glasses, but to accurately describe what is happening outside in the world and also what is happening emotionally in you or in other people. Now you can imagine that when a reality is upsetting, frightening, or even tragic, it very much helps to have this internal locus of control, right? Because it can contribute to a capacity to say, all right, this is what's happening now. What am I going to do next? To try and, we can stay on the slide, thanks. To try and move ahead in the direction that I want to go in. The second quality is to be able to then take this reality and put it in perspective. And putting it in perspective is not the same as just saying, you know, that which does not kill us makes us stronger, or this too shall pass. Those things may all be somewhat true, but they can feel trite and not very meaningful. Putting something into perspective requires knowing who you are, having a rich, nuanced sense of your identity, of what brings your life meaning, of what work you are good at, your sense of purpose, especially a more transcendent sense of purpose, because then you can take a difficult event, even a very difficult event, and think about it in the context of your own life, your life story, rather than being defined by it. You think about, how is this event going to fit into my story, into my life, and be part of my journey heading to where I choose to go. So it's not being defined by an event, but acknowledging its reality and thinking about how it fits into something that is true about yourself and your sense of purpose, your mission, your work. You're putting it in a meaningful context. And then the third quality, I did not come up with a new word for, because there is no other word that means this. The word she used to describe it is bricolage, which is a French word that comes from the verb bricoler. Only the French would come up with a word like this. I can say that I'm a quarter French, so I can make fun of the French. But bricoler is a verb with 2 meanings. And the first meaning is it describes the sudden darting movement of small mammals being pursued by a predator. So if you've ever seen your dog chasing a squirrel and the squirrel like zips around the yard, you know, and seems to always be course correcting and redirecting, zing, zing, zing. That is, it is bricolaying, to Englishify the French word. The second meaning is to improvise with what you have at hand, to serve a need. It's basically to MacGyver, if anybody is as old as me and knows what I'm talking about. So it's, if you have a need, you cast about and look around, what do you have near you, and you improvise with what's there. So bricolage collapses these 2 concepts into the idea of being able to improvise with what you have at hand to manage something that's changed in the ground, and to be able to course correct. If it's not working, you reassess and you change tracks and you move on. So it's creative and prompt, decisive action, but not rigid. It's able to be flexible and course correct. And you'll see that these 3 qualities, each of them includes a lot of different things. But the first two, being perceptive and putting something in perspective, are cognitive skills, right? They're things we do by thinking. Do you like my cognitive sign language? They're things we do by thinking. The third is a behavioral skill. It's what do we do? What do we learn to do in difficult circumstances? But if you remember nothing else from what we talk about tonight, I'd want you to remember that all three describe skills, right? Resilience is not a trait. It's not something that some people are born with, like your eye color or your height. It is a skill set. It is a capacity. Each of us is born with a capacity for resilience. It's like muscles, right? We're all born with muscles. Some of us are perhaps a little more athletic than others, but each of us can maximize our strength, and we do that by working out, by pulling against resistance, right? By exercising those muscles. And in the same way, we cultivate resilience by facing adversity, very small adversities, hopefully, starting when we're very, very young, and we get better and better at each of the component parts of these three skill sets, practicing with little adversities, like being bored, like falling off a bike, like missing a soccer goal. As we get older, it's getting a bad grade on a test, having a friend disappoint you, having a breakup, not getting into the college of your choice, learning that you're actually not good at ballet. And as we get bigger, the adversities get bigger, right? Losing a job, maybe having a big financial setback, serious illness in a loved one. But your ability, your muscle, your capacity to hold still and take in what's going on accurately, to put it in perspective, given your identity, and then to take action and correct course as needed. All of that is built with lots and lots of practice. So what we have now, I would say, is an opportunity for practice. So let's look at the next slide. This is just a slide to help us know that when resilience, again, we build it over time. And for children, the littlest children, the newest infant has very little intrinsic resilience. They depend on the adults around them for almost everything, right? They have to cry. If they have a hair around their finger, if they're hungry, if they've wet their diaper, they cry. That's it. That's their resilience. That's their strategy. They sound the alarm. But as they get older, kids just learning how to fall back asleep without a mother or father coming and rocking them is building resilience. It's building a capacity to regulate themselves. And as children grow, they internalize a lot of those skills that when they're very, very little, they depend on their family and their community for. Now, as adults, we're not perfectly resilient without our families or our communities, but we've internalized the basic skills to know when we need to turn to others, to know when we need to ask for help, to know when we need to reach out to apply for unemployment or to reconnect with a good friend, when we need different kinds of support. Okay, next slide. So, what does this actually mean for us in this setting? Because I think this particular moment, the adversity of this moment is certainly very different for everybody. In some ways, it's a very shared experience in a way globally right now. But of course, whether someone has lost a loved one, has lost a job, has lost a business, or is trying to find a way just to get through their days, homeschooling their 4 children, that's me, and still getting to work and getting things done, there's different kinds of adversity built into this. And I would really remind us to hold on to the idea that even things that are just change, or moments of uncertainty. And that's what this is. This is a moment of enormous disruptive change and enormous uncertainty, both from a health perspective, from a financial perspective, an economic perspective. So in so many ways, it feels like the ground is shifting, and that we don't quite know when it will stop or where it will be. It's not spectacularly a spectacular upheaval all at once, but we're watching it happen, and there's a feeling of powerlessness to do much about it, right? So honoring the fact that this is stressful just by virtue of all of the uncertainty that's part of it is very critical. And then I'm going to ask us to remember, what are these ingredients that we're going to hold on to? How do we find our internal locus of control? How do we honor the fact that it's valuable just to take in what's going on? That doesn't mean you have CNN on 24 hours a day, but it does mean that you face sort of full on what's happening and what it might mean for you, and absorb it. And if your first rush of feeling is almost overwhelming, then you have to find a way to help yourself just hold the feeling. You don't have to jump into bricolage if you are having a hard time bearing strong feelings. You just stay right there. But that itself, it's like you're working out with weights. You start with 5-pound weights before you graduate to 50-pound weights, or you're going to hurt yourself. So one of the things that I would say this translates into, and this can be helpful when in thinking with your kids, is to be a journalist in this moment. It's very easy in times like this to think about tomorrow, and next week and 3 weeks from now, and think about August. When will school start? That's my thing. When will school start? And when will the peak be? Will we have enough ventilators? And it's very important, if your job is to be appropriately ready, to be thinking ahead. But at the same time, protect time to be very much in the present. Now, in some ways, having kids at home can help with this, because when kids are at home, they're like, Mom, I'm hungry. Mom, I need toast. Mom, we're out of toilet paper. You have no choice but to be in the present moment. But to help everyone slow down and say, let's be journalists. This is what I mean when I say be a journalist. How are we going to describe this moment we're in? So that if we look back, I said this to my kids last week, and they all were like, whatever, Mom. Like, this is not, we're not like in your clinic. And I was like, okay. But to try and slow down enough to pay attention so that you could keep notes, make a journal, and describe what every day is like, the parts that feel boring, the monotony, the sense of distress or worry when you open your computer and you have the urge to check the news and see what's happened in New York or New Jersey, or see has another celebrity passed away, the sense of dread. Describe it. Write it down, because someday this will pass, and there will be value in being able to say what it was like when we were here in the pandemic of 2020. But beyond just building material for your book or your memoir, being a journalist really fortifies our capacity to take in what's actually going on, facts and feelings, and in some ways, the facts that may not be just numbers or deaths, but human behavior, things that matter to you, maybe in your line of work, maybe if you think about what's important in leadership, what's important to me in connectedness to my family. Take it in. Take it in and describe it. If notes help you, write notes. If you like to record things, record things. But it's a wonderful thing to ask your kids to do too, to ask them to start to create a journal and just make a few notes, 10 minutes every day, of what it was like. What did they do that day? Then thinking about your purpose. I was talking with a good friend of mine who is the head of the ICU at Cornell in New York City. And I was really worried about him. I was worried about how he was doing. Was he overwhelmed? Was he feeling burnt out? Was he safe? And he was like he's a pretty neurotic guy, and he was the most relaxed I've ever seen him. And I asked him, I was like, what do you do? Why are you doing so well? What's going on with you? And he said, he's like, I just get to go to work. He's like, this is what I've been training for all my life. He's like, I get to go to work. I have a lot of work to do, and I know exactly what I have to do. If you can think about, what's my work? Am I an artist? And it's my job to create meaningful art that either comforts people or that tells a story that's going to need to be told. Am I a writer or a poet or a musician? Am I a yoga teacher? And there's a way to post yoga classes so that my students or other people can find a way to take good care of themselves physically through this difficult time. Think about your special skills, but your broader purpose. And when our kids are younger, if we're turning to our children or our teenagers, they may not know their transcendent purpose. They shouldn't. In fact, if they think they know it, they're probably wrong, and they should be trying a lot of other things out. But invite them to think about what they like doing, and how might there be a way to take advantage of the time that we have when we're all at home to explore what you like doing and think about how what you like might be meaningful, might be helpful to other people. So thinking about your purpose and how it can be served at this moment. I was thinking about one other example is Yo-Yo Ma was being interviewed on public radio maybe. And he described, he created an Instagram video of playing his favorite piece of music for the cello that he found comforting. And he wrote, hashtag songs of comfort. And then he told some of his colleagues about it, and it's become an expansive thing. It's wonderful to check out. I don't have Instagram, but I do now because I decided I had to go find this, because you can listen to Yo-Yo Ma and then a host of different musicians play music that they have found comforting at difficult moments. Things that help us to hold still, to then be good journalists, are wonderfully valuable. And if you can contribute to those things because of your gifts or your sense of purpose, that's wonderful too. And then a critical thing in order to keep your battery charged to do this hard work. So in the same way that if you're doing a workout to build your muscle, you also want to make sure you hydrate and you rest periodically. And if you're training for a marathon, and this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint, this experience, right? This is, even if we get to our peak in 3 weeks, this is not going to be done in 3 weeks. The ripples of this experience will be going on for, I have no doubt, for weeks to months and over the next few years. That's not meant to be terrifying. It's just that this is an earthquake. This is a big one. So this will unfold over time. So you have to keep your battery charged. You have to be ready for a marathon. So the third thing is to manage the machine, right? I always say sleep comes first, but sleep comes first for a reason. Sleep is sacred. Now, some of us may feel like we have nothing to do but sleep if we're sheltering in place, but actually create a routine and maintain it so that you continue to get restful sleep. This has been my only struggle that I'm willing to, that's the hill I'll die on with my teenagers right now, is that they are not allowed to stay up after 11:30 or 12 on weekends. I'm like, you have to keep a routine where you're going to sleep at a time that you would have generally gone to sleep before this was going on, and you're getting up around when you would have gotten up for school. I'm not gonna die on the hill of get up at 6:30 in the morning, but to create a routine where they have adequate sleep and it's happening at the same time every night, and they're waking up at the same time every morning. It helps to remind your teenagers that if this may be less of a challenge depending on how they're homeschooling, but if they're getting up for, my oldest son is getting up for a 7:30 or 8 a.m. class. And if you get up at 7:30, 5 days a week, and then 2 days a week sleep until 1:30 in the afternoon, that's like moving across 4 time zones for the weekend, and then coming back across 4 time zones on Monday. That's actually exhausting for your body. It's really hard on your body. So being really religious about getting adequate sleep and having a ritual before bedtime and going to sleep and getting up at around the same times every day. Exercise is critical. Exercise is such a potent and effective way. One, it helps you sleep. Two, exercising so that you get short of breath enough that you couldn't sing for 20 minutes, 3 times a week, is as effective to treat mild to moderate depression as SSRIs, as Prozac and other antidepressants. Exercise is a very powerful medicine. So I'm delighted that we're still free to go for a walk, go for a run, stream a yoga class if you're not interested in getting outside. But being outside and getting a nature bath for at least an hour a day is very powerful stuff too. So if you can do some exercise outside, that's super powerful. And if you're home with kids, do some of this with your kids. I got home from work this afternoon, and my 2 younger kids had finished their work at some untold hour, or claimed they finished their work at some untold hour, and they were then playing a video game. And everyone was like fighting, and it was just like, you know, it was like Lord of the Flies when I got home. And I said, okay, it's sunny today. We're going out for a walk. And within half an hour, all of us were in a groove. We were having fun. The dog was happy, thank God. And we had a good time. Exercise is very powerful stuff. You don't have to be out of breath for it to be powerful. But if you can do it with a little bit of rigor, you'll sleep better. So routines. Maintaining routines is also a very powerful way to care for the machine. They don't have to be crazy, rigid, 12-step routines every single day, but setting a common schedule to go to sleep and get up by, and then thinking about the 2 or 3 things that sort of mark your day. Maybe they're meals, maybe it's exercise at a certain point, but set certain routines and hold them. That doesn't mean you can never break them. Exceptions are wonderful. Remember, we can be flexible. We can be like the squirrel darting around the yard. But routines are the structure. They're the scaffolding that then allows us to be flexible when we need to be. Nutrition, of course, eating healthfully, but healthfully doesn't mean there's not pleasure too. It's a great time. We've been baking a lot of brownies and cookies, but we still have to have you still have to have fruits and vegetables too. And engaging activities. There's, there's some pleasure in this. There's the possibility of pleasure in this moment, in that for many people, there's a little more time during the day. Think about the things that bring you pleasure. Teach someone else, a friend, a family member, a child, or a parent, or a sibling, how to do something you love. If you love knitting, if you love drumming. My son tried to teach me how to drum. It was not very successful, but it gave him pleasure to make fun of me. And I was curious about it, so that was good. But experiment with some interesting activities, and the ones that hook you, protect time for them. Engaging activities, whether they relax you or they really engage your mind, are very powerful. So those are the strategies for managing your machine. And the last piece is to maintain nourishing connections. We're talking about social distancing, and I like to think of what's been happening as physical distancing with social connection. I moved here from the East Coast, where I was born and raised and lived all my life, just about 1.5 years ago. And I've been spending more time speaking with my family and my good friends in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks than I had in the whole last 1.5 years. I wouldn't wish this situation on us, but I've rediscovered the power of maintaining really nourishing, meaningful social connections, even with physical distance. So thinking about that and really prioritizing that, making time for that, is very potent for our resilience. Keeps our batteries charged while we're building our muscles. All right, next slide. Let's see what I put on the next one. So I'm happy, I'm looking at the time, and I'm happy to maybe let us ask questions. I was going to talk a little bit about the value of stress, but I think we've talked about that. The idea that stress, look, occasionally there's overwhelming stress. I'm not saying that all stress is good. Overwhelming and traumatic stress is never good. But we don't get to pick our stresses. So when it's particularly overwhelming, then you need to just batten down the hatches and get your supports in place that are going to help you get through. But everything else, the things that are uncomfortable up through the things that are really painful and disruptive, still provide opportunity because they're a chance to build resilience, to practice, to learn what you can manage, that you can face something first, then manage it, and then even master it. And there's nothing we can't master. So we'll go on to the next one. I think I did a little graphic of that. Yes. That's like the role of stress in growth. There's a lot of really lovely studies about people who faced fairly extraordinary stresses, and it's only a subset of people who develop PTSD. It's a fairly small subset. And most people with enough time and support have what we call post-traumatic growth, right? They're fortified, they build strength and resilience. This is sort of the process that you face a challenge, you get very anxious and stressed out, and then you find a way to breathe, stay in the present, be a journalist, start to take it in and describe it. Think about how it fits in your life and think about what you're going to do. And that's the process of managing it, right? It's fraught with anxiety because it doesn't ever take it away. It just helps it get gradually better. You move a ship slowly. And gradually you realize you've experienced some mastery. You've gotten better at something. It's sort of like working out again. When you first start lifting weights, you're like, I am never going to be able to bench press 200 pounds. And then maybe 4 weeks or 6 weeks later, you're like, I'm bench pressing 100 pounds. Who knew? You do a little bit every day, and those tiny incremental changes translate to substantial growth. And that mastery builds self-confidence and knowledge. This cycle is a cycle that describes actually growing up. This is what adolescence is all about. And it's part of a talk I give when I say why stress actually is really important for adolescents to face and manage. And we don't want to step in and protect our kids and teenagers from facing difficulty. We just want to stand next to, be there with them when they're facing difficulty so that they're not alone. And we're helping to fortify their ability. Some kids are really good at being perceptive, but don't yet know how to put it in perspective, or they prefer to go hide in bed. And we have to give those kids a nudge. But we as adults are expert in our kids, if not ourselves, and what they may need to sort of face this particular moment. So maybe if there are questions, I'll see what is next. That was about sleep. If anyone has, I had a slide about sleep and one about screen time. If people have questions about sleep and screen time, I put a couple of slides in about strategies to help create rituals and routines around sleep for ourselves, but particularly for teenagers or our kids. And some of the principles that can govern screen time. I got a text from a friend of mine this morning that said the American Academy of Pediatrics had changed its recommendation about screen time to allow 23 hours a day of screen time for children. It was not the actual American Academy of Pediatrics, but I do think it's critical that we show flexibility too. And we say, there is a place for this right now, but what are we doing on screens? And how much time can we break it and go out for a walk when needed? Can we have joy together as a group, as a family, or watch a movie with loved ones, maybe on Zoom, and laugh together while we're sharing an experience where we're physically distant but connected by something? So I've taken us to 6:20. I always think I won't have anything to say, and then I yammer on and on. So I apologize for that. I'm happy to hear your thoughts or your observations or hear questions if there are any that I might be able to answer.
So if you're on Zoom and you have a question, if you would use the raise hand feature, that would be helpful. Also, there's been a pretty good exchange on the chat. So if you have any questions that you want to ask on the chat, that's great. And Dr. Swick, someone said how much they appreciate the physical distancing while socially connecting, and point that you made, and they appreciate your information that you're giving to us. And this person says, you rock. There.
I'm gonna tell my teenager that. They're gonna be like, no, you don't.
That's
Um,
great.
Well, and it's true, you know, I would urge everybody to, if there are parents or aunts and uncles, we all know who we might be particularly worried about at a moment like this, whether it's our own kids or it's good friends or others in our more extended family, people who may be vulnerable to isolation or who may be particularly anxious. And think about how we might fortify them. If it's your own child, it's often just a question of, we can talk about having children with anxiety or who are more isolated. It's finding ways to keep lobbing balls over the net, I'll say, with kids. Because kids that are a little more isolated intrinsically, who aren't talkers, or who are very private, or who are adolescents and are kind of, you know, closing their door, letting them know that we're still here and we're connected to them. You can't force them to connect back, but continuing to lob balls over the net, inviting them to come on a walk with you. They don't have to talk. They can just be with you. Inviting them to come and watch the movie that everyone's watching together. Or at a minimum, making sure they come out and join for a meal if there's someone that is isolated. And I would say if you're worried about someone, don't worry alone. Don't worry alone. It's a tough moment because you can't just, maybe if they're not in your home, you can't just go over there. But connect with others, bring other people into sort of the circle of worry so that you're not worried alone. If it's your child, connect with your pediatrician. You can call Ohana. We're not a center yet, but we do have a very small team and we're available to talk with parents. So I have a team of social workers that'll give a call back within 24 hours. And we do have some services available. We're doing most of it by video, but we're here. And our number is 831-OHANA-01. But also think about the others that are connected to your child. If you have a good relationship with, if they have a good relationship with a rabbi or with a priest, if they have an employer or had an employer, if they have a coach, reach out to that person. Even though they're not seeing your child right now, I'm sure they would be delighted with the chance to chat with them virtually or to send an email. So if you're worried about them being too isolated, expand the circle, bring more people in.
And thank you, Dr. Swick. Another question has to do with parents' feeling of kind of insecurity and inadequacy as it relates to the technology, like for their kids, doing the distance learning,
yes.
And themselves having to work from home. How do you have suggestions about how people can handle that stress and inadequacy feeling?
Well, I would start by saying, if you are actually going to bed at a reasonable hour and getting up at a reasonable hour and protecting everybody's sleep and getting a little exercise every day, you are doing spectacular self-care and parenting in this moment. That the schooling, and I'm going to get in trouble for being like, schooling doesn't matter. Schooling matters. Help set them up. I have 4 kids who are in 5th, 7th, 9th, and 11th grades. And I'm still going to work most days. And for the first week, I was pretty caught up in making sure everybody was getting support for homework and doing everything that they needed to do. And then I decided to survive this, I was like, we're going to have to do some benevolent neglect. I want to make sure they have the screens they need, that I have a little one-on-one time with each kid. But this is not going to be the moment where kids, build out their spectacular academic CV. And if it is, that particular student probably already had a capacity to do that. Instead, use this moment to cultivate their independence, look, there's one of them. And their independence, their ability to, what do you want, babe? There's a clock outside. Their independence. It's 6:24. Okay, I'll be 5 minutes. I'll be there in 5. To cultivate their independence, one of the things I did with my kids was actually say to them, do your best to do your schoolwork. If things are getting stuck, you come to us. We're going to help you with it. But I asked them to each come up with 5 things they always wanted to know how to do. And that we would think about how could we maybe build in a little time. And one of them was like, I want to learn how to shoot hoops. And I said, let's protect a little bit of your time. This is a peculiar kind of school that we're in right now. But we can also think about how do we find ways to engage and learn based on our own interests and not just on what's put in front of us. So first, be compassionate with yourself if you're feeling inadequate. You have spectacular amount of company. Lower the bar a bit, that what matters first and foremost is everyone's well-being, showing up each day. Learning will happen and growth will happen in this time. And it's not going to be because you mastered trigonometry or calculus BC. And your kids will teach you some things too.
Thank you. Any other questions? There is a question about homeless people experiencing homelessness, so I do want to save a minute for that. Any other questions for Dr. Swick? Feel free to raise your hand. Where can I see that? Oh, there we are. On the Zoom, or use the chat function. A lot of comments and appreciation for you, Dr. Swick, and the information that you're providing. A lot of questions about, are we going to be able to, share this with other people? And yes, we are recording this, and it will be available via, video. So the slides will be available as well as your information that you're speaking. So.
Okay. Well, and I'd love to hear anyone who's listening and participating who's devised some brilliant strategies that have found ways to make lemonade, perhaps sharing those ideas with us, and we might find a way to post them. I found a lot of wisdom from friends and colleagues. Necessity is the mother of invention, and sometimes we discover new and unexpected ways of raising our kids well, of teaching them, and of learning.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your encouragement and your wisdom. Really appreciate it. And I do want to just take this moment to just say something briefly about the planning and the conversation around people experiencing homelessness. There is apparently sort of a national debate about best practices. And I know that there are a lot of us who want to see these people have the opportunity to move indoors and to prevent any transmission or outbreak in the homeless community. One of the challenges that we have is that the risk of transmission increases if we take people who are customarily with one group, almost think of them as a household, and join them up with people from another group. It increases the riskiness, the risk of transmission. So right now, there's monitoring of trying to, when people do think that they have symptoms, then they get into the healthcare triaging system, and there's where some of the hotel rooms that may be needed for isolation come in handy. But at the moment, there's no blanket plan to bring people indoors into shelter because we don't have the resources to do it in a way that wouldn't put people at potentially greater risk than they already are. So that's it is a situation that is evolving as we learn more about what to do, and as circumstances change, I'm sure there will be changes. But thank you for that question, and thanks to all of you for joining us for Hot Topics, and we will be back next week at 5:30 with another topic and another opportunity to learn and share what we're all learning as this process goes forward. So stay healthy, stay safe, and thanks again, everyone, for participating.